Waitress slapped a billionaire for harassing old women. He smiled and said, "Finally, someone real. What if the person who changed your entire life was someone you'd never expect to meet in a small-town diner at 2 hours in the morning? Imagine this, a single slap echoing through a quiet diner, turning a night of injustice into a lifetime of hope. Welcome to Emotion Waves, where real stories touch your soul." Grace Chen wiped down the same coffee-stained counter for the third time that night, her tired eyes scanning the nearly empty Moonlight Diner. At 34, she'd been serving coffee and comfort food to night shift workers, insomniacs and lost souls for over 8 years. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune while rain tapped gently against the windows, creating that cozy atmosphere that made strangers feel like family. She'd seen it all in this place. Tearful reunions, first dates, last goodbyes, and everything in between. But what she was about to witness would shake her to her core and reveal something beautiful about human nature that she'd almost stopped believing in. Sometimes the most profound moments happen when we least expect them, in the most ordinary places with the most unlikely people. Where are you watching from tonight? Stay with Emotion Waves, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. Grace had always been the type of person who couldn't stand by when something wasn't right. Her grandmother used to say she had justice in her bones. And tonight, that trait would be put to the test in ways she never imagined. The diner was her second home, a place where she knew every regular customer's order, their stories, and their struggles. Mrs. Patterson came in every Tuesday for apple pie and black coffee after visiting her husband's grave. Old Henry ordered the same meatloaf dinner every Friday, counting out exact change from his worn leather wallet. These weren't just customers to Grace. They were her extended family. The trouble started when a sleek black sedan pulled up outside, its engine purring like a well-fed cat. Out stepped a man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 3 months. Daniel Harrison, though she didn't know his name yet, carried himself with the kind of confidence that money and power provided. At 42, he was used to getting whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his watch caught the diner's fluorescent light like a small star on his wrist. He entered with 2 business associates, their voices loud and boisterous as they demanded the best table, despite Grace politely explaining that seating was first come, first served. What made Grace's jaw clench was how dismissive they were, not just to her, but to the elderly customers who'd been quietly enjoying their late-night refuge. When Daniel snapped his fingers at Mrs. Patterson, asking her to move because his party needed a proper table for important people, Grace felt her grandmother's voice echo in her mind. The 3 men continued their disruptive behavior, making crude comments about the old-fashioned diner and its slow service. Grace bit her tongue as they complained about the ancient customers taking up space and laughed at Henry when he accidentally dropped his fork with his arthritic hands. But when Daniel leaned over to Mrs. Rodriguez, an 80-year-old woman who came in twice a week since losing her husband, and made a disgusting comment about what a pretty young thing like himself could do for lonely old ladies, something inside Grace snapped. Mrs. Rodriguez's face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She'd been coming to this diner for comfort, for a place where she felt safe and respected. Her late husband used to bring her here for date nights 40 years ago, and it held precious memories. Now this stranger was making her feel small and violated in the one place that brought her peace. Grace watched as Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears, her dignity being stripped away by someone who saw her as nothing more than entertainment. The other elderly customers looked uncomfortable, their safe haven suddenly feeling dangerous. Henry had stopped eating, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup as he stared down at his plate, trying to become invisible. The rain outside grew heavier, matching the storm building inside Grace's chest. She'd seen enough. Sometimes in life, there comes a moment when staying silent feels like betrayal. Betrayal of everything you believe in, everyone you love, and the person you've always tried to be. Grace's hands clenched into fists as she watched Daniel lean even closer to Mrs. Rodriguez, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a seductive whisper, but sounded more like a threat in the quiet diner. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't be shy. I bet you remember how to have fun with a real man." His friends chuckled, encouraging his behavior like hyenas around a kill. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to stand up, her movements shaky and desperate, but Daniel blocked her path with his arm. "Where are you going so fast? The night's still young, and I'm just being friendly." The word friendly dripped from his mouth like poison, and Grace could see the fear in the elderly woman's eyes, the same fear she'd seen in her own grandmother's face years ago when a different kind of predator had cornered her in a parking lot. That memory hit Grace like a physical blow. She remembered being 16, helpless, watching her beloved grandmother, the strongest woman she'd ever known, reduced to trembling silence by a man who thought age made women easy targets. She remembered the shame in her grandmother's eyes afterward. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because the world had taught her that somehow it was her fault. "Excuse me, sir," Grace said, approaching the table with deliberate calm, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave Mrs. Rodriguez alone and return to your own table." Daniel straightened up, his eyes scanning Grace from head to toe with the same predatory look he'd given the elderly woman. Well, what do we have here? The help wants to play hero." His smile was sharp and cold. "Listen, sweetheart. Mind your own business. We're paying customers, and if I want to chat with the local ladies, that's between me and them." Grace could feel every eye in the diner on her. Henry had half risen from his seat, his old frame trembling with the desire to help, but knowing his body couldn't back up his brave heart. Mrs. Patterson clutched her purse, torn between wanting to support Grace and fearing confrontation. The younger night shift workers in the corner booth watched with bated breath, recognizing that something significant was about to happen. "Sir, I'm asking you politely one more time to return to your seat and treat our customers with respect," Grace said, her voice growing firmer. She positioned herself between Daniel and Mrs. Rodriguez, who was now openly crying quiet tears of humiliation. Daniel's mask slipped completely then, revealing the ugly entitlement beneath his polished exterior. "You know what your problem is, waitress? You don't know your place. None of you do." He gestured dismissively at the elderly customers. "These old folks should be grateful for the attention. And you?" He stepped closer to Grace, invading her personal space, "should learn when to keep your pretty little mouth shut." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Grace felt the weight of every woman who'd ever been told to stay quiet, every elderly person who'd been treated as disposable, every moment when good people chose silence over action. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory. "Justice in your bones, Gracie. Don't ever let them dim your light." If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up on Emotion Waves. What happened next would change everything, not just for Grace and Daniel, but for everyone who witnessed it. The slap echoed through the diner like a thunderclap, sharp and final. Grace's hand stung from the contact, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Daniel's head snapped to the side. His perfect hair mussed, a red mark blooming across his cheek like a badge of justice. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the rain seemed to pause in respect for what had just occurred. For a moment, nobody moved. Daniel's hand slowly rose to touch his cheek, his eyes wide with something Grace couldn't quite identify. She expected rage, threats, and demands for her job. She braced herself for the storm that was surely coming, her mind already racing through explanations she'd have to give to her manager, the possible consequences she'd face for striking a customer. But what happened next defied every expectation in that small-town diner. Daniel began to smile. Not the predatory smirk he'd worn moments before, but something else entirely. Genuine, surprised, almost relieved. He took a step back from Grace, his hands dropping to his sides as he looked around the diner with new eyes. The elderly customers watched him warily, Mrs. Rodriguez still clutching her purse but no longer cowering. Henry had fully stood now, his arthritic back straight with dignity restored. "Finally," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Finally, someone real." The words hung in the air like a confession. Grace stared at him, confusion replacing her righteous anger. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected from a man accustomed to getting his way. His business associates shifted uncomfortably, clearly as bewildered as everyone else. Daniel ran his hand through his disheveled hair and let out a long breath. "Do you know how long it's been since someone told me no? Since someone stood up and said, 'That's enough'?" He looked directly at Grace, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Exhaustion, loneliness, a deep weariness that money couldn't cure. 15 years, he continued, his voice growing stronger. 15 years of people saying yes to everything, agreeing with every terrible idea, laughing at every bad joke, pretending my money made me a better person instead of the worst version of myself. He turned to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watching him with cautious curiosity. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. What I said and did was inexcusable. You deserve respect, not some rich fool's idea of entertainment." The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that Grace felt like she was watching two different people occupy the same body. The arrogant predator from moments before seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked genuinely ashamed and strangely grateful. Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face for a long moment, her keen eyes searching for sincerity. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her earlier tears. "Apology accepted, young man, but actions matter more than words." Daniel nodded, the truth of her statement hitting him visibly. He looked around the diner again, taking in the faces of people he'd dismissed as irrelevant minutes before, people with stories, wisdom, dignity that he'd been too blind to see. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment when someone's reaction completely changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments on Emotion Waves. The night was far from over, and Grace sensed that something profound was shifting in the heart of this strange, complicated man. What happened next surprised everyone, including Grace herself. Daniel slowly removed his expensive jacket and laid it across the back of an empty chair. Then he did something that made the entire diner hold its breath. He approached Mrs. Rodriguez with careful, respectful steps and gently asked, "Ma'am, may I sit with you for a moment? I'd like to hear about your husband, if you're willing to share." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened in surprise, but something in Daniel's demeanor had fundamentally changed. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by genuine humility. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded toward the empty chair across from her. "His name was Eduardo," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of love. "We came here every Saturday night for 23 years before he passed." As Daniel listened, really listened, Grace watched his face transform. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about Eduardo's terrible jokes, his habit of leaving sugar packets in the shape of hearts on their table, how he'd always ordered 2 pieces of pie so she could have both if she wanted. The stories were simple, beautiful, and utterly human. Daniel found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word like a man discovering water after years in the desert. "He sounds like he was a good man," Daniel said quietly when she finished. "Thank you for sharing him with me." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd worn since Daniel entered the diner. And you know what? I think he would have liked that you finally learned to listen." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she watched this unlikely connection unfold. Her anger had cracked something open in Daniel, but it was Mrs. Rodriguez's grace that was healing it. Around the diner, other customers began to relax, sensing that the danger had passed and something beautiful was taking its place. Daniel's business associates, growing increasingly uncomfortable with this display of humanity, made excuses and left, their expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum as they fled back to their world of transactions and power plays. Daniel barely noticed them go. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he wanted to be. He spent the next hour moving from table to table, not as the entitled customer who'd walked in, but as someone genuinely interested in the lives around him. He listened to Henry's stories about working in the steel mills, laughed at Mrs. Patterson's tales of her mischievous grandchildren, and even helped the night shift workers solve a crossword puzzle clue. Grace watched from behind the counter, refilling coffee cups and trying to process what she was witnessing. The man who'd made her so angry an hour ago was now sitting with Henry, looking at faded photographs of the old man's late wife with the attention of someone viewing priceless art. When Daniel finally approached the counter where Grace stood, his eyes held a different light entirely. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "That courage you showed tonight, that willingness to stand up for what's right, is that something you do often?" Grace tilted her head, unsure where this was leading. "When it matters, yes." Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something important to himself. I have a proposition for you. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel Emotion Waves for more heartwarming tales. What Daniel was about to offer would change not just Grace's life, but the lives of everyone in that small-town diner. I want to fund a foundation, Daniel said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. A foundation that creates safe spaces like this one, places where people of all ages can find community and dignity, and I want you to run it. Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? Daniel smiled, not the predatory grin from before, but something warm and genuine. You showed me something tonight that I'd forgotten existed. Integrity. The courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. I've been surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear for so long that I'd forgotten what honesty looked like. He gestured around the diner, taking in the elderly customers who were now chatting comfortably. The warm light reflecting off worn Formica tables, the sense of belonging that permeated every corner. This place, what you've protected here tonight, it's precious. People need spaces where they're valued for who they are, not what they can provide, where wisdom is respected, where kindness matters more than net worth. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been listening from her table, spoke up with a knowing smile. Eduardo always said that sometimes the best thing that can happen to a lost soul is getting their compass reset by someone who still knows true north. Grace felt overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. But as she looked around the diner, her diner, in every way that mattered, she began to understand. You're serious about this? Dead serious, Daniel replied. I spent 15 years accumulating wealth and losing my way. Tonight, a brave waitress reminded me that there are things more valuable than money. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure places like this exist everywhere. That people like Mrs. Rodriguez and Henry have somewhere to go where they're treated with the respect they deserve. Over the following months, the Moonlight Foundation became a reality. Grace left her job at the diner to oversee the creation of community centers across the country. Warm, welcoming spaces that served meals, hosted story-sharing sessions, and provided intergenerational programs that connected young and old. Daniel funded it all, but more importantly, he remained involved, not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who'd learned to find joy in genuine human connection. The original Moonlight Diner became their flagship location, with Mrs. Rodriguez serving as a volunteer coordinator and Henry leading a weekly storytelling group where elderly patrons shared their life experiences with younger visitors. Grace kept the same coffee-stained counter, but now it served a greater purpose as the heart of a movement that spread kindness across the nation. Daniel never forgot the lesson of that rainy night. That real wealth came from lifting others up, not putting them down. He and Grace worked side by side, two people from completely different worlds, united by a shared belief that everyone deserves dignity and respect. The foundation's motto, suggested by Mrs. Rodriguez and inscribed on every center's wall, read simply, "Justice in your bones, kindness in your heart." Grace often thought about her grandmother's words as she watched. Elderly visitors light up when young volunteers ask to hear their stories. Sometimes the most important moments happen when we least expect them in the most ordinary places with the most unlikely people. If you enjoyed this story on Emotion Waves, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that it's never too late to find your way back to what truly matters.